The invitations arrived on a Tuesday, gilt-edged, sealed with silver wax and carrying the faint scent of rosewater. In St. Mary Mead, an invitation from Lady Ashworth wasn't simply a card, it was a summons. And nobody, not even those who privately despised her, thought to decline. By the evening of the winter ball, Ashworth Manor glowed against the frozen sky like something lifted from a story. Frost laced the iron gates. Carriages crunched along the gravel drive. Inside, the great hall blazed, crystal chandeliers throwing warm light across silk gowns, polished medals, and faces arranged into their most becoming expressions. The orchestra played Strauss. Footmen moved like ghosts between the guests, trays balanced, eyes forward. Champagne caught the light. Laughter rose and fell in practiced waves. And yet, something sat beneath all of it, quiet, patient, the way a splinter sits beneath skin. Not visible, not named, but felt if one knew how to feel such things. Miss Jane Marple knew. She stood near the far window, a glass of warm elderflower in her gloved hands, watching. To anyone passing, she was simply a white-haired old woman in a pale blue cardigan, slightly out of place among the jewels and ceremony. Precisely as she preferred it. Her eyes moved across the room the way they always did, unhurried, methodical, the way one reads a village, not for what is shown but for what is carefully kept hidden. Colonel Reginald Hartley stood by the punch bowl, laughing too loudly at something Lord Ashworth had said. A broad man, decorated, certain of his place in any room. But his jaw was tight beneath the laughter. His glass, as Miss Marple noticed, hadn't moved in 20 minutes. Nearby, Mrs. Cecily Alderton, young, dressed in winter white, recently widowed and recently arrived in the village, Weist Ice Allwood, smiled at everyone and looked at no one. Her gloves were buttoned to the wrist despite the warmth of the hall. The orchestra swelled. The dancers turned. Miss Marple took a quiet sip and waited. She had attended enough village gatherings to know that the most dangerous moments rarely announced themselves. They arrived gently, dressed beautifully, and wearing someone else's name. The clock above the mantelpiece had just struck midnight when the music stopped. Not gradually, the way orchestras wind down between sets, but suddenly, mid-note, as though the instruments themselves had been startled into silence. A few dancers stumbled. Laughter caught in throats, and heads turned. Near the punch bowl, a footman stood frozen, his tray tilted at a dangerous angle. At his feet, Colonel Reginald Hartley lay perfectly still, for one arm outstretched, his champagne glass shattered beside him, the spilled liquid spreading slowly across the marble floor like something trying to escape. For a moment, nobody moved, then everyone moved at once. Lord Ashworth crossed the floor in 4 long strides. Lady Ashworth pressed her fingers to her lips. Dr. Pembridge, who had been stationed near the fireplace with a whisky and a private conversation, set down his glass with deliberate calm and made his way through the gathering crowd, unhurried in the particular way of men who have seen death before and learned not to show their feelings about it. He knelt, pressed 2 fingers to Hartley's neck, waited, then stood. Heart failure, he said quietly, adjusting his cuffs. The Colonel was not a young man. The excitement of the evening, perhaps. These things happen. Inspector Colworth, who had been enjoying a rather good plate of smoked salmon near the entrance hall, appeared at the edge of the crowd with his notebook already open. More from habit, Miss Marple suspected, than genuine intention. Quite right, he agreed, barely glancing down. Nothing suspicious here. We'll have the doctor's report by morning. No need for alarm, ladies and gentlemen. The crowd murmured. Someone began to cry softly near the cloakroom. The footmen were quietly directed to close the east doors. Miss Marple had not moved from her position by the window. She watched Dr. Pembridge smooth his jacket. She watched Inspector Colworth close his notebook without writing a single word inside it. She watched the footman who had first found the Colonel, a young man with sandy hair and an ink stain on his left cuff, slip quietly toward the service corridor without being asked to give a statement. Then she set down her elderflower, picked up her small beaded evening bag and walked toward the punch bowl. Not quickly. There was no need for speed. The important things had already happened. Now it was simply a matter of reading them correctly. The marble around Colonel Hartley was cold and still. He lay on his back, expression almost peaceful. The kind of peace, Miss Marple thought, that does not come naturally, but is arranged. His left hand was curled loosely at his side. His right hand was extended, fingers open, and as though he had been reaching for something in those final seconds, or releasing something he could no longer hold. She did not touch him. She simply looked. The shattered champagne glass lay in 3 clean pieces, not the scattered fragments of something dropped in panic, but the deliberate geometry of something placed. The spilled liquid had pooled in an almost perfect crescent, undisturbed at its edges. No splash pattern, no scattering. A glass dropped by a falling man does not land like that. Miss Marple's gaze moved to the punch bowl table. 6 glasses remained on the silver tray, evenly spaced, but there was a gap. Not at the end of the row where a glass would naturally be taken from, but in the middle, as though a specific glass had been selected, chosen. Her eyes moved left. A pair of white evening gloves lay folded neatly on the corner of the table, and a lady's gloves, small-fingered, pearl-buttoned. Forgotten, perhaps, or left. The right glove sat on top of the left, which was entirely ordinary, except that the left glove was turned slightly inward at the wrist in the particular manner of a glove removed from the right hand and not the left. Someone had worn them on the wrong hands. Miss Marple did not pick them up. She straightened, turned slowly, and let her eyes travel across the room until they found Mrs. Cecily Alderton. The young widow stood near the arched doorway to the east corridor, a fresh glass of champagne in her hand. Her third of the evening, Miss Marple had counted now, speaking quietly with Lady Ashworth's niece. Her expression was composed, suitably grave. Her eyes were dry. And then Lord Ashworth's voice carried across the room, announcing formally that Colonel Hartley had passed, that the evening would conclude out of respect, and that carriages would be arranged. A ripple of reaction moved through the crowd. Gasps. A stifled sob. Someone clutched their companion's arm. Mrs. Alderton raised her hand to her mouth, but she did it 3 seconds too late. Miss Marple noticed. She always noticed these things. Not because she was looking for guilt, but because she had spent a lifetime watching people in drawing rooms and church pews and village shops, and she knew with the quiet certainty of long experience that genuine shock does not wait for its cue. It arrives without permission, before the mind can manage it. Mrs. Alderton's grief had arrived precisely on time, which meant it had been rehearsed. Doctor. May Pembridge reappeared at Miss Marple's elbow, his tone low and professionally final. "Sad business," he said, "but straightforward, I'm afraid. The Colonel's heart was never strong." "No," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly, her eyes still resting on Mrs. Alderton across the room. "I don't suppose it was." She paused just briefly. "Tell me, Doctor, did you know the Colonel well?" Pembridge straightened his cuffs again. "Well enough." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "I rather thought so." She turned from the punch bowl, her beaded bag held lightly in both hands, and moved back toward the window. Behind her, the footman began quietly clearing the Colonel's glass from the floor. They did not notice that Miss Marple had already memorised every detail of exactly how it had fallen. The orchestra did not play again that night, and the chandeliers burned on regardless, indifferent, brilliant, illuminating a room full of people who had just watched a man die and were already deciding, each in their own careful way, what story they would tell about it come morning. Miss Marple thought of her garden in winter, of how the frost made everything look clean and undisturbed, even when the ground beneath it had been thoroughly turned. Villages were like that. People were like that. And murder, real murder, the quiet kind, was always like that. Patient, dressed beautifully, wearing somebody else's name. The morning after the winter ball arrived grey and indifferent, the kind of morning that pulls no curtains and makes no apologies. St Mary Mead wore its frost quietly. Smoke climbed from cottage chimneys. The post office opened at 8, and by 9 o'clock, the village already knew 3 different versions of what had happened to Colonel Hartley. Miss Marple knew none of them were correct. She had slept little. Not from distress. She was not a woman easily distressed. But from the particular restlessness that came when a puzzle had arranged itself just far enough to be interesting and not yet far enough to be solved. She had lain in the dark with her eyes open, turning details over the way one turns Riverstone's patient, looking for what lived underneath. The glove on the wrong hand. The glass placed, not dropped. The widow who laughed 3 seconds too late. By 9:30 she was dressed, her blue cardigan buttoned, her walking shoes laced, and her small leather notebook tucked into her coat pocket. She did not carry it to write things down. She carried it so that people assumed she was writing things down and therefore spoke more freely in her presence, believing themselves merely observed and not understood. It was a small deception, one of many she had found useful over the years. Her first call was to Mrs. Alderton. Cecily Alderton was lodging at Wisteria Cottage on the eastern edge of the village, a pleasant enough arrangement for a woman recently arrived and not yet committed to permanence. She answered the door herself, which told Miss Marple something. A woman expecting scrutiny keeps her housekeeper close. A woman who believes herself safe answers her own door. Miss Marple. Her smile was warm, practised. What a surprise. "I do hope I'm not intruding, dear," said Miss Marple, already stepping inside with the gentle inevitability of someone who has never once actually intruded in her life. "I simply couldn't bear the thought of you being alone after last night. Such a dreadful business." The sitting room was tastefully arranged, but not quite personal enough to be lived in, not quite impersonal enough to be rented. A vase of white roses on the mantel, a writing desk with its lid closed, a fire that had been burning since early morning, judging by the depth of the ash. Miss Marple accepted tea. She complimented the roses. She spoke for several minutes about nothing in particular, the cold snap, the vicar's new curate, the dreadful state of the lane near Ashworth Lodge, and watched Mrs. Alderton's shoulders descend, fraction by fraction, from their careful height. People always relaxed eventually. Yes, that was the thing about them. They could not help it. The body wanted to rest, and the mind, reassured by small talk and warm tea, eventually allowed it. "You knew the Colonel well, I suppose?" Miss Marple asked, at precisely the moment Mrs. Alderton reached for a second biscuit. Hands occupied, guard lowered. The hand paused, just briefly. "We were acquainted," Mrs. Alderton said. "Through mutual friends, as one is in these circles." "Of course," Miss Marple nodded pleasantly. "He was a great friend of your late husband's, I believe." The pause this time was longer. A fraction of a second, no more. But Miss Marple had spent decades measuring fractions of seconds in drawing rooms, and she knew precisely what they cost. "They knew each other," Mrs. Alderton said, "years ago, before Gerald died." "Yes." Miss Marple set down her teacup. Funny how the past follows one, even to a winter ball." Mrs. Alderton looked at her then. Really looked, for the first time since she had opened the door. And something moved behind her eyes that was not grief and not quite fear, but lived in the narrow corridor between them. "I'm not sure I follow, Miss Marple." "No," said Miss Marple kindly. I don't suppose you do." She stayed another 10 minutes. She spoke about her roses. She left. Dr. Pembridge kept his surgery on the High Street, between the ironmonger and the lending library. A position Miss Marple had always found quietly revealing about his character. A man who placed himself between utility and knowledge, considered himself both, and trusted others to agree. She did not make an appointment. She simply arrived. Why, he received her in his consulting room with the slightly strained courtesy of a man who had not expected company and had been doing something he preferred not to explain. The desk was clear, too clear, the deliberate blankness of a surface recently tidied rather than naturally uncluttered. A faint smell of pipe smoke hung in the air, and beneath it, something sharper, almost chemical. Miss Marple did not look at the desk. She looked at his hands. They were steady. Professionally, deliberately steady. The hands of a man reminding himself to be calm. "Dreadful night," she offered. "Quite," said Pembridge. He gestured to a chair. Though not entirely unexpected, as I said, the Colonel's health had been declining. Had it? Miss Marple settled into the chair with the unhurried ease of someone who had all day and knew it. He seemed rather vigorous at the harvest supper in October. Danced twice, I recall. Outward appearances. Pembridge waved a hand. The heart keeps its own counsel. Indeed it does, said Miss Marple, as do old friendships. You and the Colonel. You served together, didn't you? Before the war, I mean, in the same regiment. Something shifted in the room. Not dramatically, not visibly, but the air changed the way air changes before weather. A pressure adjustment, subtle and absolute. We overlapped briefly, Pembridge said, years ago. I wouldn't call it a friendship precisely. No, said Miss Marple. I imagine you wouldn't. She asked him two more questions. Both entirely innocuous, on both entirely beside the point, and left him standing at his surgery door with the carefully neutral expression of a man who had just realised he was being read like a letter he thought was sealed. Lord Ashworth received her in the library. He was a tall man, silver-haired, with the particular exhaustion of someone who has spent a lifetime being important and found it less satisfying than promised. He stood by the window when she entered, hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the frozen grounds. Miss Marple. He didn't turn immediately. I expected the inspector. Inspector Colworth is filing his report, she said pleasantly. Heart failure, I understand. Now he turned. His eyes were careful. That is the finding. Yes. Miss Marple moved to the bookshelf and ran one finger lightly along a row of spines, not reading them, just moving the way one moves to give a conversation room to breathe. Curious thing about the Colonel. He wrote to you last week, didn't he? Lord Ashworth's chin lifted slightly. He wrote to many people. He was a sociable man. Yes. Miss Marple drew her finger to a stop at a slim leather volume. Though I wonder if this letter was rather less social in nature. Something about the Alderton estate, perhaps? The matter of Gerald Alderton's will? The fire crackled. A log shifted and settled. Lord Ashworth said nothing, which, Miss Marple reflected, was really rather a complete answer. These old villages, she said softly, almost to herself, turning from the bookshelf. Everyone believes their secrets are their own. Wait, but a village remembers everything, Lord Ashworth. Every letter, every alliance, every arrangement made quietly and expected to stay that way. She moved toward the door, then paused, one hand resting lightly on the frame. The Colonel knew something that made him dangerous, she said. Not because he was a threatening man, but because he was about to do the right thing. And someone in that ballroom last night could not afford to let him. She smiled, the gentle, mild smile of a woman discussing weather or garden bulbs. I think I shall call on the Ashworth housekeeper this afternoon. She has such a remarkable memory for detail. These long-serving staff always do. Lord Ashworth's jaw tightened. The door clicked softly behind her. Outside, the frost had begun to thaw at the edges, just slightly, just enough to show what lay beneath. Miss Marple walked the high street without hurry, her coat buttoned, her notebook untouched in her pocket. 3 conversations, 3 silences, each shaped differently, each hiding the same thing. The picture was almost complete. Almost. One thread remained. The thin, crucial thread that connected the glove, the glass, and the widow's mistimed grief into something a court of law could follow. Something beyond observation. Something proved. She knew where to find it. The footman with the ink stain on his cuff had seen something the night before and left before being asked. Young men with ink stains on their cuffs wrote things down. Letters, perhaps, or records. Or if one was fortunate, the kind of quiet notes that careful people keep as insurance against the powerful. Miss Marple turned toward the village post office. She had one more call to make. The post office in St. Mary Mead was many things, vacati, a place to send letters, collect parcels, purchase stamps and but above all it was the village's most reliable archive, not of documents or records, but of movements, of patterns, of who sent what to whom and when, and whether their hands had trembled while doing it. Mrs. Doris Fellows had run the post office for 31 years. She was a small, sharp-eyed woman who remembered every registered envelope and forgot nothing she had ever been told in confidence. A combination, Miss Marple had always felt, that made her considerably more useful than any filing cabinet. She looked up from behind the counter as Miss Marple entered. And her expression arranged itself into the particular alertness of someone who had been expecting this visit and was quietly pleased it had arrived. "Miss Marple." She set down her stamp book. "I wondered when you'd come." "Then you've been thinking about last night," Miss Marple said. "Hasn't everyone?" Mrs. Fellows glanced toward the door, then back. She lowered her voice, not from secrecy, but from the habit of a woman who understood that certain conversations deserved their proper register. "Young Thomas came in this morning, first thing, before we'd even opened properly." Thomas, the footman, sandy hair, ink-stained cuff. "To post something?" Miss Marple asked. "To collect something?" Mrs. Fellows reached beneath the counter and produced a small brown envelope, unclaimed, addressed in a cramped, hurried hand. "A note arrived 3 days ago, marked for collection only. Colonel Hartley's name on the back as sender." She paused. "Thomas said the Colonel had asked him to collect it if anything. And I remember the exact word he used. If anything happened." Miss Marple looked at the envelope without touching it. "And did Thomas collect it?" Mrs. Fellows shook her head. "He lost his nerve. Left without it. Said he needed to think." She pushed it gently across the counter. "I thought perhaps someone sensible ought to have it instead." Miss Marple picked it up. It was light, a single folded page at most, the kind of weight that carried enormous consequence. She did not open it at the counter. "Thank you, Doris," she said quietly. "He was a good man," Mrs. Fellows said. "The Colonel. Difficult, sometimes. But good underneath. Yeah, and the good ones always seem to go first, don't they?" Miss Marple tucked the envelope into her coat pocket beside the leather notebook. "Not always," she said, "but often enough to notice." She read it at home, at the kitchen table, with a fresh pot of tea and the particular stillness of a woman who has been moving toward a single point for 2 days and has finally arrived. The Colonel's handwriting was firm and angular, slightly compressed. The script was for of a man accustomed to writing orders, not confessions. But this was as close to a confession as Reginald Hartley had ever. Not his own. Someone else's. It was dated 4 days before the ball. It described in plain and careful language what the Colonel had discovered 3 months prior, a detail buried in the paperwork surrounding Gerald Alderton's estate, or which he had been asked to witness as a family friend 2 years before Gerald's death. A discrepancy. A clause inserted after the original signing. A clause that redirected a substantial portion of the Alderton inheritance away from Gerald's sister, the rightful heir, and towards Cecily Alderton, the young second wife, whose marriage to Gerald had lasted 14 months and whose grief at his passing had been, by all accounts, impeccably performed. The clause bore 2 signatures. Gerald Alderton's, forged, the Colonel was now certain, having compared it to a dozen earlier documents, and a witness signature that belonged, unmistakably, to Dr. Edmund Pembridge. The Colonel had intended to bring it forward, quietly, through proper channels, without spectacle. He had written to Lord Ashworth, a justice of the peace, an old friend, but requesting a private meeting at the ball. A discreet conversation, the beginning of doing the right thing. He had not lived to begin it. Miss Marple folded the letter, set it on the table, poured her tea. She sat with it for a long moment, not because she was uncertain, but because she understood that the space between knowing and acting deserved to be honoured. A man had died. Not dramatically, not with ceremony. He had simply been removed, the way one removes an inconvenient document, quietly and completely, by someone who had decided that their own comfort outweighed his life. That required a moment's stillness before anything else. Then she picked up the telephone. Inspector Colworth arrived at Ashworth Manor at 3:30, which was later than Miss Marple had hoped, but earlier than she had feared. He came, nice as she had requested, without announcement. Wait, a small mercy, given what needed to happen next. She had asked Lord Ashworth to arrange one final gathering. Tea, she had suggested, just the relevant parties. A chance, she had said with perfect mildness, to clear up 1 or 2 small details before the inspector filed his final report. Lord Ashworth had agreed with the strained compliance of a man who understood he was no longer directing events. They assembled in the east drawing-room at 4 o'clock, Lord Ashworth standing near the window again, unable to sit, Mrs. Cecily Alderton on the settee, composed in grey wool, her hands folded, Dr. Pembridge in the armchair nearest the door, which Miss Marple noted with quiet interest. A man who sat nearest the exit had already decided on some level that he might need it. Inspector Colworth stood to one side, notebook open this time, pen uncapped. He had read the letter during the carriage ride over. He had not spoken since. Miss Marple poured the tea herself. "I want to thank you all for coming," she began, settling into the chair opposite Pembridge with the unhurried ease of a woman opening a parish meeting. "I know it has been a difficult 2 days. Grief is tiring, even—" She looked up briefly, pleasantly. "The grief one has to remember to perform." Mrs. Alderton's chin lifted. "I'm not sure what you mean by that," she said. "Don't you?" Miss Marple lifted her teacup. "You laughed, my dear." At the moment Lord Ashworth announced the Colonel's passing, just 3 seconds before everyone else received the news. She set the cup down, not because you are cruel, but because you had already known for 3 seconds. And the body, relieved of its tension, reacts before the mind can correct it. The room was very still. The gloves were a practical matter, I imagine, Miss Marple continued almost conversationally, that the powder residue, whatever compound Dr. Pembridge provided, would have transferred to the palm during application. Wearing them reversed protected the skin, a small detail. But details, in my experience, are where the truth lives. Pembridge shifted in his chair, just slightly. "This is absurd," he said. His voice was measured, professional. "You are an old woman telling stories at a tea table, Miss Marple." "Yes," she agreed. I rather am. And the story I'm telling is this." She reached into her coat pocket and placed the Colonel's letter on the table between them, unfolded. Illegible, the signatures visible from where Pembridge sat. Colonel Hartley witnessed the forgery. He had documented it. He had written to Lord Ashworth requesting it be addressed, and you, Doctor, knew, because Mrs. Alderton told you, that the Colonel intended to speak that night. She paused. Let the silence do its work. You arrived at the ball with a compound that mimics cardiac arrest, and one that dissolves completely, leaves nothing for a routine examination to find, and acts within 40 minutes of ingestion. You are, after all, a medical man. You understood precisely what the inspector would and would not look for." Pembridge said nothing, but his hands, resting on the arms of the chair, pressed slightly harder against the fabric. The knuckles, Miss Marple observed, were pale. "The glass was placed, not dropped," she said quietly, "and a falling man does not arrange his champagne glass in 3 clean pieces. The punch bowl table was wiped, not from tidiness, but from necessity. And the gloves," she glanced at Mrs. Alderton, "were left behind in the small, hurried panic of someone who had just watched their plan succeed and lost. For one unguarded moment, the discipline that had held them together all evening." Mrs. Alderton's composure did not shatter. It simply released, like a knot pulled from both ends simultaneously. Her face did not crumble. It emptied. Something behind her eyes went very quiet and very far away. "He was going to ruin everything," she said. The words were almost calm, almost matter-of-fact. Gerald's money, the house, everything I had spent 3 years building. He was going to take it apart with one letter. "Yes," said Miss Marple gently. "Well, he was going to do the right thing. Those are often the most dangerous people of all." Inspector Colworth stepped forward. Pembridge stood, and then didn't move, because there was nowhere, really, to go. The door behind him led to a corridor, and the corridor led to a village, and the village, as Miss Marple had told Lord Ashworth that very morning, remembered everything. Later, when the carriages had gone and the manor had settled back into its frozen quiet, Miss Marple stood alone for a moment in the east drawing-room. The tea had gone cold. The fire had burned low. The letter lay on the table where she had placed it, its work done. She thought of the Colonel, not as she had last seen him arranged on cold marble, but as she had seen him at the harvest supper in October, dancing, laughing. A broad man, was certain of his place in any room. He had died trying to be honest. In a ballroom full of beautiful liars, he had been the only one without a performance to give. Miss Marple picked up her coat, her bag, her gloves, décompte, worn as always, on the correct hands. Outside, the last of the frost was melting from the manor gates. The village lanes stretched ahead, familiar and quiet. Smoke rising from the cottages. The post office lamp already lit against the early dark. St. Mary Mead looked perfectly peaceful. It always did. That, Miss Marple reflected, stepping through the gate and onto the lane, was precisely what made it so very dangerous. She walked home through the cold without hurrying, past the bare hedgerows and the frosted garden walls, content in the way she was always content at the end. Not with satisfaction exactly, but with the quieter thing that lived just beneath it. Justice, she had long believed, was rarely dramatic. It didn't arrive with thunder or speeches. It arrived the way truth always arrived in a village, small, unhurried, and absolutely inevitable. Like frost at the end of winter, present, patient, and impossible to ignore.